You don't have to keep bringing me food, you know? I know. Why do you? Because you're here and you're hungry. Most people look away, pretend they don't see me. I'm not most people. No, you're not. Flora Nash was 35 and had lived in Ashwood, Virginia, her entire life. Her mornings followed an unchanging rhythm. She woke at 5:30 a.m., brewed a strong cup of black coffee, tied her chestnut hair into a neat ponytail, and buttoned her uniform with quiet care. The walk to Linden Cafe took 7 minutes, past rows of quiet homes, the faded American flag on the corner pole, and the closed windows of small-town life just before sunrise. She had been working at the cafe for 7 years. It sat at the edge of town between a shuttered antiques shop and a hardware store that still used a manual cash register. The walls were chipped, the floor creaked in the back, and the smell of coffee mixed with grease lived in the curtains. But it was home. In its own modest way, to the regulars, Flora was dependable, kind, and always composed. She moved through the narrow aisles between booths with practiced ease, never rushed, never idle. Her voice was soft, almost hushed, and her smile, though small, felt sincere. No one knew that after each shift she packed leftover rolls and muffins into a paper bag and dropped them off behind the old train station where a few men and women without addresses waited. She never stayed long and never said a word. It was not charity to her, it was memory. Mid-November brought the cold wind early that year. Leaves scraped the pavement, and morning light arrived late through a haze of gray clouds. On one such morning, Flora noticed a man enter the cafe who didn't match the usual pattern. He was elderly, likely in his 80s, African-American, with a posture that resisted the weight of time. His coat was faded army green, the kind issued long ago, and on the sleeve was a nearly worn-out unit patch. He walked with quiet dignity, boots scuffing gently against the tile, and took a seat at the far corner booth by the window, away from the warmth of conversation. He didn't order food. He simply asked for water. Flora brought it without hesitation, placing it gently in front of him with a paper napkin tucked underneath. He gave her a small nod, his eyes tired but alert, like someone who had seen enough of the world to no longer need to explain himself. She didn't ask anything, just smiled and walked away. The next day he returned, same coat, same seat, same request, and again the next. Flora noticed how he always arrived just after the breakfast rush, as if to avoid the crowd. His presence was quiet, his gaze often fixed outside the window or on a small weathered book he kept tucked in his coat. He never lingered longer than necessary. He never asked for more than the glass of water. On the 5th day, something in Flora stirred. When the kitchen sent out an extra plate of scrambled eggs, she took it to him without a word. She placed it down and said the order had been made by mistake. He looked at her for a moment, cautious, uncertain, but picked up the fork and began to eat slowly, as though the act itself needed permission. That unspoken meal became the beginning of a quiet ritual. Each day that followed, she brought him a new dish, pancakes one morning, oatmeal with cinnamon the next. She always gave the same excuse: extra order, kitchen mix-up, forgotten ticket. He never questioned it. He never asked for more. He simply accepted the food with the same nod, the same slow, careful movements. There was a gentleness to him, and a heaviness too, like a man built of iron and memory. One afternoon, while clearing tables, Flora passed by as he reached into his coat and pulled out an old leather wallet. Inside was a folded photograph, the edges frayed from time. It showed a young man in military uniform standing in front of a tan-colored barracks. The expression was serious, the stance familiar. Flora glanced at it just long enough to realize it was him, decades younger. It wasn't her business, and he didn't speak, but something in her paused. By the end of the week, she learned his name from a note he accidentally left on the table, a small envelope with a prescription receipt. Tucked inside, Greg Couch, 83 years old, a veteran of the Afghanistan conflict long before the country began forgetting that war. She didn't tell him she knew. She just made sure the biscuits were fresh the next morning. She began to notice the way he held the cup with both hands to keep them from shaking, how he folded the napkin perfectly in half before placing it beside his plate, how he always left $2 under the glass of water, as if to repay something he knew he couldn't afford. The cafe staff barely noticed him. Most customers didn't look twice, but Flora did, and in those quiet mornings, when the booths were mostly empty and the town was still waking up, she found herself looking forward to the small figure by the window. Not because he spoke, not because he offered anything in return, but because something about his presence reminded her of dignity, one that refused to vanish, even in silence. Whispers began in the kitchen. First, they were nothing more than idle comments exchanged over clattering pans and steam from the dishwasher. But as the days passed, the whispers took on shape and tone. Noreen, the oldest of the waitresses after Flora, was the first to speak. Openly. She had a clipped voice and lips that rarely curved into anything resembling warmth. She took pride in efficiency, in rules, in things that made sense to her. To her, feeding a man who didn't pay made no sense. A cafe, she often said, with a disapproving glance toward Flora's section, was no place for charity. Other staff didn't echo her out loud, but their silence became louder with time. They exchanged looks when Flora carried food to table 6, the booth by the window where Greg always sat. They muttered behind shelves or shook their heads subtly when orders went out without tickets. What started as quiet kindness began to feel like defiance, though Flora never meant it that way. Customers noticed, too. Regulars began to watch more closely, not just the man who came in and never ordered, but the way Flora treated him. One man, in particular, always in a gray blazer with a corporate insurance patch on his sleeve, scoffed loudly one morning. He called it a soup kitchen masquerading as a business. He didn't lower his voice. Others chuckled, but the discomfort lingered. In the air long after he left, Flora didn't respond. She never did. Conflict wasn't in her nature. She had learned long ago that defending kindness only hardened those unwilling to understand it. So she kept bringing the meals, always with the same practiced explanation: an extra omelet, an unsold bowl of soup, a forgotten order of glazed donuts. Greg never asked for them, never questioned. He simply ate slowly and respectfully with the posture of someone raised to be grateful, even in silence. After each meal, he reached into his coat for his book. It was old, the spine faded, and the pages worn thin at the corners. He had wrapped it in heavy cloth as if to preserve its structure or its meaning. Sometimes he read, lips moving faintly over the words. Other times he simply looked out the window, watching the street, watching the sky, as if waiting for something no one else could see. There was a quietness to him, a patience that made his presence feel steady, even when the cafe buzzed around. Him! By the start of the second month, the cafe's manager called Flora into the back office. The room was small, cluttered with old receipts, a filing cabinet that didn't quite close, and a desk that always smelled faintly of stale coffee. He didn't raise his voice, but his tone was tight. Free food wasn't in the budget, even small. Losses added up. Flora offered to cover the cost herself out of her tips. The manager sighed, told her to keep it quiet, not to make a habit out of it for others. She agreed. She wasn't looking for recognition. Outside the cafe, something unusual began to stir in Ashwood. Unfamiliar cars parked near the courthouse, at the gas station, along the quieter streets. They weren't flashy, but they weren't typical for the town either. Men in uniform began appearing, always discreet, always composed. No questions, no introductions. They came and went with precision, like visitors with purpose. One morning, a retired colonel named Harvey Lawson came into Linden Cafe. He was tall, weathered, with the bearing of a man who had never let his shoulders slump. He ordered coffee, then walked straight to table 6. He didn't speak to Greg. He just sat beside him. They didn't acknowledge one another outwardly, but something passed between them in stillness. 2 days later, another man arrived, a general with silver trim on his collar who looked out of place beneath the flickering ceiling fan and checkered floor tiles. He joined them silently. Then came another, General Miller, quiet and observant. They never disrupted the routine. They never drew attention to themselves. They simply occupied the booth beside Greg's and stayed until he finished his meal. Other patrons began to notice. The quiet veteran by the window was no longer alone. The presence of men in uniform, decorated and precise, brought a shift in atmosphere. The mocking comments dwindled. Conversations paused whenever the trio entered. Noreen stopped her muttering. Her glances remained sharp, but her voice grew quiet. Flora continued as before. She brought the meals without comment, left them in front of Greg, nodded once, and returned to her work. But now something had changed. The cafe that had once judged now watched, and slowly, without anyone announcing it, a sense of respect began to grow, thin at first, like the first frost of winter, but undeniable all the same. The atmosphere inside the cafe began to shift in subtle but undeniable ways. The once invisible figure at the window booth now drew quiet nods, second glances, and the kind of restrained deference typically reserved for men in uniform, even if the uniform he wore was only memory. Some customers, especially those who had served or had family who did, began treating the old man with a form of silent recognition. They didn't approach, didn't speak, but their body language changed. They no longer looked through him. Others remained skeptical. Noreen, in particular, grew sharper in her movements, more forceful in the way she stacked plates or scribbled down orders. She still muttered to herself, still shook her head whenever Flora placed food in front of Greg, though fewer and fewer people listened. One afternoon, when Flora brought out a warm lunch, beef stew, and a thick slice of cornbread, one customer, seated a few booths over, stood abruptly. He looked around the cafe with theatrical disapproval, left his bill unpaid on the table, and walked out with slow, deliberate steps. Noreen caught Flora's eye and whispered something under her breath, something about turning the place into a magnet for vagrants. But her words lacked force now. The tone in the cafe had changed. The regulars no longer laughed with her. Several mornings later, a change occurred at Greg's table. Flora noticed it first when she came by to pour his usual glass of water and set down his breakfast. Sitting beside his fork was a small, circular object, dull but well cared for. It was a military dog tag, the metal slightly worn, the engraved letters still legible. His name, his service number, a trace of something that once hung around a soldier's neck in a place far from home. Next to it lay a folded clipping, torn from a newspaper and creased at the edges. Flora glanced at it as she cleared a nearby table, and when she had a moment alone behind the counter, she opened it carefully. It was an old article, faded with age, chronicling a rescue operation in Afghanistan in 1982. The language was stark, the tone restrained, but the story was clear. Under heavy fire, a small team had extracted wounded soldiers from an ambush site. One of the names listed among the rescuers was Greg Couch. It described his actions without flourish, just facts. Risked. Exposure carried an injured man to safety, refused evacuation until the last soldier was secured. Flora read it twice, then folded it again and returned it gently to where she had found it. She said nothing, but something within her shifted. He had not just served, he had saved lives. He had been brave. And now he sat quietly, day after day at a small-town cafe table, recognized by almost no one. As January crept in, the cold deepened. Morning frost painted the windows of Linden Cafe, and the bell above the door jingled softly against the chill each time a customer entered. On a particularly still morning, just before the cafe opened, 3 black SUVs pulled into the narrow lot. They moved in a staggered formation, precise and quiet. Doors opened with uniform timing, and men in full military dress stepped out into the cold. They aligned themselves in silence outside the front windows, forming a formal row. Their uniforms bore insignias of rank, campaign ribbons, and polished boots that cut through the slush on the pavement. Inside, the regulars had already begun filtering in. Cups clinked, silverware scraped gently, and conversation hummed in soft tones. Then the cafe fell still. The sudden presence of decorated officers was jarring, unexpected. Every sound seemed to pause. The first through the door was Colonel Harvey Lawson. Behind him followed 2 generals, one tall and lean, the other broader, with the posture of command built into his every step. They didn't speak. They didn't scan the room. They moved directly to Greg's table. Flora stood frozen behind the counter, one hand resting on the edge of the register. Noreen paused mid-step near the coffee pot. The customers, sensing something rare and reverent, slowly stood. No words were spoken. One of the officers approached Greg, placed an envelope on the table, and stepped back. Greg took his time. He adjusted his glasses with care, unfolded the envelope with deliberate movements, and read the contents without expression. His eyes scanned the page once, then again. Finally, he placed the letter neatly back inside, set it on the table beside his book, and stood. He didn't speak, didn't look around, didn't acknowledge the attention. He simply rose to his feet, steady but slow, and stood tall. He seemed to gain height as he did, as if decades had fallen from his shoulders. The uniformed men snapped to attention, their hands raised in precise salute. The cafe, now silent, watched as respect filled the room like a rising tide. Something long buried had been brought to light. Something forgotten had been remembered. The uniformed men stood in perfect formation, heels together, back straight, eyes forward. Their movements were precise, practiced, and reverent. It was not a gesture meant for spectacle, but for honor. The cafe remained still around them, as if the quiet itself had become part of the ceremony. The hum of conversation had stopped. The clinking of dishes had paused, and every person in the room stood watching with the solemn understanding that something rare was unfolding. One of the officers, a man with silver hair and ribbons across his chest, turned slowly toward the counter. He faced Flora with a gaze that held no judgment, only gratitude. His expression was solemn, but not cold. He nodded once, then lowered his hand in a slow, deliberate motion, a signal of thanks not just from one man, but from a collective voice. It was not loud. It didn't need to be. His presence carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken acknowledgments. He stepped forward only a pace or two, and in the stillness that followed, Flora understood. It was not about the meal, not about charity. It was about dignity. It was about a woman who had looked at an old man and seen a human being, not a burden, not a statistic, not someone to be avoided or ignored. She had offered warmth without question, sustenance without condition, and the institution he represented, built on discipline and tradition, had come to say thank you. Across the cafe, heads were bowed. Even Noreen, who had once scoffed and whispered, now looked down at her shoes, her hands still at her sides. She didn't speak. The sharp lines in her posture had softened, her shoulders slightly lowered. Something inside her had shifted too, even if she would never name it. Greg reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, worn at the edges. He placed it gently in front of Flora without a word. When she opened it, her breath caught. Inside was a medal, round, polished, and edged in gold. The inscription was brief, formal, a citation of valor. It was the same medal mentioned in the article she had read weeks before. the one he had earned by risking his life to save others in a place most Americans had long stopped thinking about. She hesitated, eyes glancing up to meet his. He didn't speak, but his eyes told her everything. He had chosen to give this part of himself to her. It wasn't payment. It was trust. She tried to refuse, her hand starting to slide the box back across the counter, but he shook his head once, slowly, with finality. The gesture was firm, gentle, and absolute. She closed the box with care and held it to her chest, not as a trophy, but as a promise. The next morning, something new appeared in the cafe. Where Greg had once sat, there was now a plaque affixed to the wood paneling of the booth. The letters were etched in brass and framed by a dark oak border. It read simply, "This seat is reserved for those who served. No date, no name, just a truth that would remain." Customers took notice. No one tried to sit there. Veterans began stopping by more often, some in uniform, some in street clothes, marked only by the caps they wore or the way they carried themselves. A small donation jar appeared on the counter, labeled quietly, Veterans Relief Fund. People began leaving more than spare change, bills folded neatly, envelopes slipped in without ceremony. A sense of purpose began to take root beneath the clatter of plates and the scent of coffee. Mark, the manager who once worried about budgets and policies, printed a new sign and placed it near the entrance. The words were simple, printed in bold. Black letters, "If you're hungry, we will feed you. No questions, no judgment. No one leaves hungry." He didn't announce it. He just taped it to the glass and returned to the back office. No one laughed. No one rolled their eyes. The cafe had changed. Permanently, Flora continued her routine. She still brewed the coffee before sunrise. She still folded napkins into neat triangles and wiped down the counters twice. She still greeted customers with the same quiet smile, but something in her had settled. There was a steadiness in her now that hadn't been there before, a deeper stillness in the way she moved. In the pocket of her apron, beneath her notepad and receipt slips, she carried Greg's military dog tag. It rested there like a talisman, cool against the fabric, a silent reminder of someone who had once sat alone and had been seen. Most people moved on. The moment passed into town memory, into quiet retellings and small nods of respect. Greg's visits became less frequent. No one knew where he went, but his presence lingered. His absence was not emptiness, it was legacy. Flora felt it in the weight of the tag in the booth no one dared occupy, in the way strangers now watched one another with a little more patience. She kept working, she kept showing up. The world outside didn't always notice, but within those four walls something had been restored. Not because of noise or speeches or grand gestures, but because one woman had looked at an old man and decided that kindness was enough. That hunger in any form deserved a response, and so she moved through her days with quiet purpose. Almost forgotten, but never fully, not by him, not by those who stood with him, not by the people who watched and finally understood, not by her.